All right. Well, unexpectedly, I have a little bit of stage fright coming up here. So just if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'd like everybody to join me in taking a quick deep breath. So we'll do that in 3 seconds. Everybody? All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so my name is Maxwell. I'm a developer relations, a fairly newly minted one, over at Near DevHub. Near DevHub is actually a new initiative in the Near protocol ecosystem where we've been trying to truly make an open source community about rewarding open source contributions from people who don't really have a strict affiliation to a company or anything in the space. So I am genuinely super stoked with this lineup today and really excited to get into it. I wonder if we can just go down the line, everybody say who you are, what you do, and why do you care about open source?
Wait, I'm not supposed to take up all the time just with that. And have a mic on. Do I need a mic? We can share. Hello. There we go. Hello, my name is Boris Mann. I am the founder of a company called Fission. We build an entire edge compute stack, identity, data, and of IPFS and content addressing. We've been working in the Filecoin and Protocol Labs ecosystem. Before that, I helped kick off a lot of the unconference vibes with Ethereum, the Ethereum Magicians, did the second Ethereum Magicians unconference gathering in Berlin, leaned into being an administrator of the Ethereum Magicians Forum, and did a lot of work in the early governance days. Going farther back, I helped create the Drupal Association in 2004 in the early foothills of open source. And I care about open source because at its base, it is thought to be a license and legal, but in fact, open source has 3 definitions. One, it's a legal innovation where people use the tools of copyright to make something copyleft and lock it open. The second thing that it is commons-based peer production, aka lots of people around the world collaborating on code together, which has many other forms to it. And 3, it's an ideology that says, dude, I already wrote those bits and it was a lot of work and it literally cost me nothing to make you a copy. The really hard part is, can you come over here and help me maintain this over time? And so I'd like to talk about that a bit.
Hello, my name is Violet, or Aleph V. I am a security and cryptography researcher. I work with Spearbit. I've done a lot of zero-knowledge proof implementations. I dropped out of my math PhD to join the space. And I think the reason that I'm really interested in open source is because it extends the reviewability properties of like academia and peer review to code bases. It's one of the most critical security properties whenever you're deploying a system, designing cryptography, or anything else, is getting enough collaboration to ensure that your system is actually doing the thing that you want it to do.
Hello, now. Hello everyone, I'm Eduardo Antuna. I've been in the ecosystem since 2017, more or less. Always focus on open source projects and public goods. I'm one of the co-founders of dappnode, and yeah, I have a big trouble to be here in regards of open sourcing, so more or less I know all the issues and everything that is it's hard to maintain public goods and open source. It's something that we haven't seen in the last years. And yeah, it's my focus to create public goods and open source code, so I think it's the way to go, and the only way to
go. Terry Culver, Executive Director at Digital Finance Group. We're an investment company. And you know, I care deeply about open source because I think the true innovation here is censorship resistance. That is a unusual and increasingly, in my view, fragile principle, especially as the sector grows. And open source, whether it's a process or a culture or a value, is to me, one of the fundamental mechanisms that protects, the goal of censorship resistance.
Awesome. So touching a little bit on that, you mentioned fragility. Violet, you are a security researcher, correct? So why is open source important for keeping your protocol or project or whatever it may be safe?
Generally, the larger the number of eyes that can look at a code base before it is put into production, the more likely that someone will have an insight that allows them to help you not be hacked. I think generally the average person with enough skill to hack a code base is not malicious and they want to help you. And so if you make your code private, the only people who will put in enough effort to try to hack you are the ones who don't want to help you. And so by making your code open source, you help yourself and you help all of your users and increase the security of your system by allowing more people to actually review your code.
Anybody want to riff off of that?
First of all, I think open sourcing is mandatory, but this doesn't give you any kind of extra protection. I mean, this feeling that something that is open source is more secure, for me, is not true. It's even more risky. I think it has a lot of properties, like have more contributors, have more people taking a look to it, making it stronger. But just because it's open sourcing, you don't need to have this feel of security. And we have saw in the past smart contract hacking and other issues. And the game changer really is, before in the past with Web2, everything was more secure because it was secure. Now it's more harder even because we are exposing all our bugs to anyone. And you can have really good contributors to help you to improve it, but you can also have attackers. So it's even a risk to make the things open source. That is why it's really important to understand what that means. It means that you probably are going to attract more talent to the ecosystem. That is also really important. It is going to help you to improve it, especially if you create bug bounties and these kind of programs. But you need to not be completely safe because it's open source. And that is something really important to understand, I guess.
May I ask a follow-up question? So, I mean, it's a different security paradigm, right? Instead of security through withholding information, it's security through making it transparent. And there's certain vulnerability now. Do you think that changes over time, or do you think that vulnerability or that lack of security is always just part of open source?
Well, the thing is, I just remember one thing that happened, I think 2 years ago, something like that, an open source project, someone contributed to this project and add a vulnerability on purpose, and this pull request was merged. So at the end, it's a new paradigm, obviously. I think it helps to have more eyes looking on it, but you need to have this level of risk management and know that you are exposing all of this. So at the end, it's like you need to provide good bounties, because otherwise, if the issue that we have right now also is we are changing the paradigm, but also we are having too much open source projects that it's impossible all the people to take a look to all of them.
So the defaults, does anyone know what the default warranty is with their open source software? Have you looked at your warranties recently?
Like the license?
Yeah.
Yes.
Use as is, no warranty, good luck. I think there's some really interesting discussions here that come back to pooling capital and working together. V and I were actually talking about, I was saying like, yeah, I've got some code, I know it needs to get audited at some point. I don't have a lot of money, but as we get more users, probably we're gonna pool some funds and get an audit done. And then we'll have like a shiny rotating hologram of V in there that says thumbs up. But we don't ask questions like this, right? So does your project, and when we talk about open source, we talk about it as if it's a thing. Okay, so it's a repo, cool. Who owns the repo? Who has admin to the repo? What is your process for reviewing it? Who has the keys to those things? Are your commits all signed? And then we're like, oh shit, this open source stuff is a lot of work. I'm like, it is work. Who's getting paid to do the work, right? I think open source is evolving. We keep using this shorthand when we actually mean a bunch of different things, and we mean community, and we mean protocol, and a bunch of other stuff like that, right? We don't talk a lot about specifications, right? I actually care less about open source code these days because we've had a movement towards protocol first. So the first thing you need is someone to actually write something down. We did a bunch of work. Ethereum's in a pretty good spot now with the work that's been done in formal specs so that you can actually write an implementation. ETH2 got a lot better, and so on. But we're actually still evolving from, I made some code, and you need to be bug compatible with the APIs, to we write specs, whose product then is multiple implementations. Right? So I think we're still in this continuum that we actually have to move past a bunch of these things and actually ask harder questions about who's in charge, who cares, what are the process. You always have the right to fork. You always have the right to hire your own security researcher.
So oh, sorry, did you want to go ahead, please?
To expand on that, I think that maybe this is a hot take, but I don't think many projects in the crypto industry are sort of actually open source. Like, they develop everything in private and then they put it into the world, and they expect that their users will read 5,000 lines of Solidity. And like, I've read 5,000 lines of Solidity before, and let me tell you, that's not a fun like Saturday night. So like,
should have written in a Viper.
But I think like what's much more important is to develop a process. Like, the best way to add security to your project through open source is to bring in a lot of contributors. Because if one person writes a lot of code, they are very likely to write in their own blind spots. Whereas if you have a lot of contributors, like you were saying, and you develop specs and you plan everything out, and you actually make a project that is built by a community and not by a person, and then in private and then pushed into the world, you will have a much better product in the end.
Awesome. I want to kind of ask a potentially open-ended question, but I hope we won't go too long on this. Given that contributing to open source is hard, and given that contributing to open source is not typically very rewarding, why do people do it anyway?
I mean, this is a really easy question. I, an aging, middle-aged white man with quite a lot of privilege, have some free time because I offload a lot of my emotional labor. And so I tinker with a few projects in my spare time. And I really get a lot of fulfillment with that, like I'm building for humanity's future, just by myself.
I have a different answer. Which is, I think that open source actually is a way for you to be able to build a strong reputation. I think this has become a meme, like, oh, all of your GitHub squares should be green. But I do think that like you, as like someone who is trying to break into an industry who might not have certain privileges or not have certain credentials, open source is one of the best ways to do this, because like you can prove in a way that is like very hard to doubt that you can actually do the job by doing it for free. And this isn't always accessible to everyone, but it is actually a very good way to break into an industry if you aren't a middle-aged white man with a reputation.
I actually really like the non-credentialism of open source is extremely important, right? You can rock up to a repo, put the time in, and get started, right? You need to have other advantages, but that's totally possible, yeah.
Well, in general, I think it's, well, the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, are we talking about for-profit open source code or public goods? I think that is really, really different. Because when you are seeing the open source of a for-profit company, the first question that you are going to ask yourself is, why I'm going to contribute to this code? That makes sense if someone taking benefit of this. The public good things is quite different at the end. It's when you have values and you believe in the project. It makes more sense and it's easy for people to contribute these kind of projects. At the end, it's personally, I believe in privacy and decentralizations, and I want to contribute on that direction from the very beginning. So for me, it's easy to contribute to these kind of projects, but for other projects, for me, it makes no sense. And that is the race. The incentivation about contributing open source is really important to take into account. And yeah, mainly that's my feeling on this.
One aspect that maybe has not been mentioned yet is community. So I think open source attracts a lot of developers who want to engage in a certain way within certain limits and with certain values. And open source allows them to do that.
I do want to, so thank you for sticking with my jokey answer. It's a problem, and it's something that I didn't realize 20 years ago when I started participating in open source. And another thing is that back then, in the mid-2000s, Microsoft was the big enemy, and open source was a radical act. Unfortunately, in 2023, open source is no longer a radical act. You put it on your resume, and maybe you're not quite aware if it's a for-profit corporation or what the structure is of what you're contributing to. And that a lot of ultimately younger developers have grown up in a post-GitHub world where it's like, hey, you share code, that's open source, right? I'm like, it's in fact a lot of dependabot merging is what open source is, which feels a lot like work. One of the things I would really like to see is recognize open source as labor and recognize that it requires privilege. And I would like to see a lot more people from the global south and a lot more diverse areas, not just getting dribs and drabs of bounties, but earning their way into kind of open source as small business, right?
I think this is actually like something that ties into what I wanted to say next, which is I think a lot about open source and then the dichotomy between extrinsic and intrinsic motivations for people, right? Intrinsic motivations and like the nobility of wanting to contribute to something open source as a passion project or something to, I guess in a less altruistic way, put on your resume, that's great. But obviously, as we've seen with crypto, for instance, extrinsic motivation also vastly increases the amount of like labor power you can bring to bear. And maybe that gets wasted sometimes on dubious, bits of certain projects. But anyway, I wonder if any of you have thoughts on that. Like, how do we balance those competing interests to make sure that we get the people who care enough and are qualified enough to contribute to these repos, but also make sure that if somebody can't just go off and work on a passion project, that we can somehow let them do that work anyway and like feed themselves on it, like rent and ramen, Sorry, that's a big question. So.
Oh, you've kicked it all down to
Yeah,
me?
let's do that.
Okay, well, we've had a very simple but non-sustainable way of doing this, which is we just fund them.
Bold. So what you're saying is you turn VC dollars into open source code that gives back tenfold on your return from an ecosystem perspective. Oh, sorry, do you want 100x? You can pick your number.
No, I like X's and O's. It's not really just the X. I think it's not that direct, and we don't see it that way. I mean, it's really about building up an ecosystem and having developers who are able to contribute to that in a meaningful way and in a sustainable way is absolutely necessary for that ecosystem to grow.
Yeah, maybe we need to talk.
Yeah, quick follow-up. Oh, do you have a...
Yeah, I wanted to comment something quickly. We have been talking about community, and the thing is, community is something that doesn't happen magically. I mean, if you open source your code, you are not going to have people contributing to it. Build a community is something of the hardest thing to do right now, because there are not too much people on this ecosystem right now.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Okay, sorry then. Go ahead.
No. I'm saying keep going, but like, I've experienced this profoundly over the last 5 or 6 months. So.
Yeah, the thing is, when we started this project in 2017, at the beginning we were just 4 guys building this, and believing that dappnode is going to help people. And the amazing thing is a community start to happen. I mean, we make it grow, but not directly. It's something that happens naturally, and you cannot force it. At the end, the good thing is, at the moment that you have it, you realize that you have it. It's a strange situation.
So how do you make an attractive community?
Providing value to users. At the end, the thing that happens in dappnode is that it's a public good. It's providing value to the users, and the thing that start to happen that they themselves start to help each other to try to improve it, to be sure that the product follow the direction that they want, trying to help you. And without the help of the community, it will be possible to be here today with dappnode, and I'm really proud of that. And it was really hard, but it's something that you need to build and make it grow.
I have like a lot more that I want to talk about with y'all, but I'm seeing 00 on the clock over there. I just have one last hot take question that I want to ask you all. I recently watched this talk at DEF CON 31 from Cory Doctorow about fighting the enshittification of the internet, which is basically a process by which somebody builds a platform funded by VCs. Eventually they can't make money for the VCs, so they start screwing their users. Eventually they can't make any money because it's all going to the users and the VCs, and they take more for themselves. And then basically everybody loses because you end up with worse products in the end. How does open source and like, what is the vision? How can we fight this?
So for starters, we really have to keep going on the protocols over platforms path. And there are many other standards bodies. We didn't invent it. We're actually broadly quite shitty at governance and working on standards. But protocols gives us some hope that even if a particular code implementation goes bad, does something, whatever, you can have another implementation that will interop and will work with that. I think the second thing is we have to start adding friction for users. But wait, Boris, you're not supposed to have friction. You have to have buttery smooth UX where you just like stick a credit card in with recurring billing at the end. I actually want that, but I want that recurring billing to go into something like Open Collective or Gitcoin or whatever if you want to go crypto native, where the user very directly understands that they're actually, if you like this product, you should pay for it. I think there might be something that's sort of like shop local or buy local that we could do to empower users to say, you could own this software.
I think it's like Patreon has kind of shown us that people do care about the people who make the things that they care about, right? So I think that's definitely something I think about a lot.
I also would like to shill maybe a slightly controversial license pick, which are the licenses which allow you to charge businesses over a certain amount of revenue for the use of your code. I think this is a very good way to build up what he was mentioning earlier, which is open source as a small business. If you build something that is useful to a lot of very large businesses, you should naturally become a software as a service business by simply being open source.
Is that like the contract revenue, the Canto thing?
It's called the Big Time license. If you do a search for it, and basically look it up, we'll post some links to open source. I almost said Twitter. Don't do that. Later for it. Great recommendation.
Yeah, well, I would like to have recordings of my conversation with PC because they are really, really fun. Because the first question that they ask you is how many users do you have? And our answer to that was, we are not tracking users. So at that moment the conversation ends, and that makes that makes it really hard to get VCs involved on this. But at the end, in our case, we understand this as a public good. We are trying to get grants. We are trying to generate value, and also to capture value. Obviously, the final purpose is to make this project sustainable. Obviously, if in this path we found any way to get a business model that makes sense, I mean, it really makes sense because it's the only way to go to the next stage. At the end, when you are just surviving with grants, it's like for most of the time we were only 4 people working on this. That makes really, really hard. So at some point, I hope that we can try to find a middle term between VCs and public goods and open source. I think it makes totally sense.
That's a great point to pass to you, Terry. Do we have to wrap this up?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Oh, yeah, so I just think that you know, in the same way that we're trying to innovate with the technology, we should also be trying to innovate with the financing that enables that technology, which was referenced in a great panel earlier today. And for us, anyway, we take a principles-based approach to investment, and I think that allows us to view things with a slightly different risk profile and timeline.
Awesome. So I think that's all with the time we have, but thank you so much. And yeah, come ask more questions of these amazing open source people.